Meno complains to Socrates that, in a kind of a jokey, actually really kind of flirty way, I would say, that Socrates has made him numb. And certainly what he means by that is that Socrates has confused him, and that Socrates has made him at least doubt, that he really knows what he thought he knew about virtue. And again, we've discussed in this dialogue the fact that Socrates believes that that's a good thing, that becoming numb in that sense is a necessary step towards gaining true knowledge, because it's necessary to realize one's ignorance, so that one does actually look into the truth of things. And what Socrates does with the slave boy is certainly meant to convince Meno that the enterprise of looking for what we do not know is a worthwhile one, and that we'll be better off by becoming numb and then by engaging in inquiry. On page 17 at 84b, Socrates describes where the slave boy is in his inquiry. He says, "You realize, Meno, what point he has reached in his recollection. At first, he did not know what the basic line of the 8-foot square was. Even now, he does not yet know. But then he thought he knew, and answered confidently as if he did know. And he did not think himself at a loss. But now he does not think now he does think himself at a loss, and as he does not know, neither does he think he knows." That is, the slave boy is in a state of ignorance, which he was before, but he's in a better state of ignorance because he knows that he's ignorant. And then a little bit below that, at 84, just below 84c, Socrates asks, "Do you think that before he would have tried to find out that which he thought he knew, though he did not, before he fell into perplexity, and realized he did not know, and longed to know?" "I do not think so, Socrates." "Has he then benefited from being numbed?" "I think so," Meno says. So again, it's kind of a strange situation, because Socrates seems to be very interested in convincing Meno that it's worthwhile to keep on trying to find out the nature of things, and specifically the nature of virtue. That will be better off for it, and he continually says that. But to my mind, except for the assertion that knowledge is recollection, and the supposed demonstration of it with the slave boy, has he really answered in a substantive way Meno's objection about the possibility of inquiry? That's an open question in this dialogue. But the dialogue does move forward. At the end of it, after the end of this very interesting episode with the slave boy, and some very interesting mathematics, I would say, simple mathematics, simple enough even for me, interesting and kind of funny thing happens. At the end of all this, where Socrates goes to such great, extravagant lengths to convince Meno that it's worthwhile to continue asking the question, what is virtue? On page 20, at 86d, Meno says, "Certainly, but Socrates, I should be most pleased to investigate and hear your answer to my original question, whether we should try on the assumption that virtue is something teachable or is a natural gift, or in whatever way it comes to men." And then Socrates, in a very interesting passage at 86e and through into 87, just sort of throws up his hands and says, I give up. I've been trying to convince you that it's, we have to answer this question about what virtue is before we can address your original question about whether or not it's teachable, but I failed to convince you, Meno. And that's a very interesting thing dramatically, especially considering what has just happened with Meno's human slave, who has been willing to engage in fundamental inquiry and to learn and to persevere, where Meno, the great nobleman, has shown that he's, if not incapable, then at least unwilling to do the same thing. So the last part of the dialogue gets into some very interesting territory, because Socrates says, well, okay, we'll look into this question of whether virtue is teachable, and even though we know that we need to answer the question, what is virtue, before we can with any confidence, answer the question whether it's teachable. We'll try on different hypotheses about the teachability of virtue and try to come to some understanding of it, and that's really what the rest of the dialogue is. And as you well know, it ends in a very sort of ambiguous way. Would that be? Not an ambiguous way. I mean, yes, an ambiguous way. It ends with an assertion that virtue must be a gift from the gods, and that may be true, I mean, but that certainly is a very strange way, considering the kind of things that Socrates has said before, to conclude that virtue is not knowledge, that just what they conclude, that virtue is something you either have or you don't, and that it must be a gift from the gods, and those who have got it from the gods are lucky, and the rest of us aren't. That's a very strange sort of conclusion, considering a lot of the things that Socrates has said, where he strongly hinted that virtue must be a form of knowledge in the earlier parts of the dialogue. So what they do is they try on this hypothesis that virtue is teachable, and Socrates says, well, I guess if it's teachable, it must be a form of knowledge, and the question is whether it's a form of knowledge, and he gives various arguments, which I would like you to look at, and we'll look at in the study questions, to the effect that virtue is a form of knowledge, and therefore must be teachable. But then, he asks this very strange question, and then things take a kind of a strange turn. After all this, on page 23 at 89D, Socrates says, I am not saying that it is wrong to say that virtue is teachable if it is knowledge, but look whether it is reasonable of me to doubt whether it is knowledge. Tell me this, if not only virtue, but anything whatever can be taught, should there not be of necessity people who teach it and people who learn it? That is, if virtue is teachable, there must be teachers of it and students of it, people who learn from those teachers. Which is, kind of a doubtful thing. That is, if it's inherently teachable, does that necessarily mean that there are teachers of it? Maybe it's teachable and there aren't yet teachers of it, but they go on that basis to then ask the question, are there really teachers of virtue? And maybe that's what, at the end of this dialogue, Socrates is really interested in pursuing for its own sake. Are there actually teachers of virtue in Greek society? And this was where I would say the dialogue in this third section gets away from the sort of basic, fundamental theoretical questions that it has dealt with mostly so far, having to do with the nature of virtue in itself and the possibilities of going from ignorance to knowledge and the possibilities of philosophical inquiry. It goes from that to a more political and ethical concern with the nature of Athenian or Greek society in general. I guess Athens, which is always Socrates' main concern, his city, and the fate of the city of Athens and the character of the city of Athens, and whether there are actual teachers of virtue and whether anybody actually teaches virtue to anybody else becomes a concern, and that's where this fourth character in the dialogue, Anytus, comes into it, who has very heavy connections with the fate of Socrates, which we'll discuss in the last video on the Meno.